Hey there, Equity Warriors. Welcome to our Summer Professional Learning Series, and thanks so much for tuning in. Today, we have the fourth of our 10 special episodes designed to support you as a parent, a caregiver, educator, leader, or supporter of your local schools. And if you're hearing but not seeing the PowerPoint presentation, I know that you're listening on one of the audio podcast channels, and I do so much thank you for tuning in. These sessions with the PowerPoint presentation have been published on the YouTube channel with full video support. So that's where you'll see the screen with the notes and goodies on that, as well as download the handouts and resources. So if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, look down in the notes for that link so you can watch these sessions as they've been designed. Now, today we have the second of 3 episodes developed especially for teachers, educators, coaches, and consultants, those people who provide professional learning to classroom educators. But I do also recognize that there are others in the audience who may learn from what I'll share today. Now, as educators, we all want our learners to have a solid command of the English of school. It's the language of college, career, military that our learners will need when they finish high school and go out into the world. And as parents and as school leaders, we want our classrooms to be places where learners are respected and affirmed for all that they bring to school. We want their learning to be additive, not subtractive of the language and culture of home. But just how do we do that? How do we bridge the sociocultural languages of home when it isn't something that we've been typically taught in our schools of education? Well, let's dig in. There is a handout for this session, and if you have not already downloaded it, take a look down in the notes, grab that link, press pause, download, print, and then come right back. All right, in today's workshop, big ideas. We're going to recognize exactly what I mean when I talk about sociocultural language. We're going to focus specifically on African American Vernacular English and Chicano English. And we're going to apply some strategies for supporting these emergent bilingual learners. And yes, our learners who speak a sociocultural language are emergent bilingual learners. And then we're going to practice adapting a lesson to support those learners. But let's start with what I mean. What am I talking about when I say sociocultural language? Well, that's language that's shaped and influenced by social and cultural factors. And this can include different aspects, such as the social context in which the language is used, whether it's a formal versus an informal setting. It can be the cultural norms and values that guide how people communicate. Sociocultural language emphasizes that language is not just some system of signs and rules. Instead, language is a complex social phenomenon. It is deeply embedded in the cultural context. And through that perspective, through that lens, we highlight the important role that language plays in shaping our social interactions and our understanding of the world in which we live, and especially the world in which our children, our learners live. Now, it's important to note that sociocultural language is not some simple something that we've just decided to pull out and talk about. It is a multidisciplinary field of study. Linguists, sociologists, anthropologists, and other scholars all bring a unique perspective to understanding how culture and society influence language. And this can range from studying how language varies across different regions or social groups, sociolinguistics, to examining how language shapes our thoughts, our perceptions, and that is cognitive linguistics. And what's the significance? Well, first we have social factors. When we think about language and culture, right, we have community and group identity, social class, gender, age, occupation. There are cultural factors embedded in our language, traditions, customs, values, taboos, euphemisms, idioms, and expressions. Language has a tremendous amount of variation to it. There are geographical variations. Just think of, no matter where you are, think about the different accents you hear. Now, I'm a native Californian, born and raised in California. I would say that I have no discernible accent, but I do live in Houston, Texas. And so when I'm talking to people who are native Houstonians, they might suggest that I talk funny or different, or that I have an accent, right? So geographical variations. There are social variations in our language and contextual variations, such as the way we speak, the register, the style, of our speech, and code switching, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. Language also plays a big role in our identity, in shaping our personal identity, our group and cultural identity, and even the type of language that's used within groups and out groups. And language has a great deal of connection to power dynamics in society, the language that we use that shows that we have power or that we don't. We have a lot of concerns around political correctness. And so the way language changes to maintain a certain amount of political correctness. And language is very often used in persuasion and manipulation. Of course, for example, today, I'm going to try to persuade you to use some strategies and recognize the value of sociocultural languages in your classrooms to improve the instruction of children who come to school speaking these languages. But before we delve into the specifics of African American Vernacular English, and sometimes I'll use the acronym AVE, and Chicano English, I want to take just a minute to talk about the importance of understanding and supporting our emergent bilingual learners. Educators, we are responsible for creating a safe and inclusive learning environment for every child, regardless of their language background. When we understand the unique linguistic characteristics and cultural context of our students, we help them. When we are culturally connected and culturally aware, we can help them feel valued, respected, and confident in their ability to succeed academically. And our classrooms are becoming increasingly diverse, so it's essential for us to be equipped with knowledge and skills to support all our learners effectively. Emergent bilingual students often face a number of challenges that can impact their academic success in the classroom. If they have limited school English proficiency, if there are cultural differences, and just the challenge of navigating between multiple languages and dialects. But a lot of times we don't recognize that sociocultural language speakers are emergent bilingual learners. And I want you to change that thinking today. Because by understanding their needs and incorporating some inclusive teaching strategies, we can foster a sense of belonging and empower our students to achieve their full potential. So in this session, again, I'm focusing just on two specific sociocultural languages that are often misunderstood, definitely underrepresented in our educational settings. That's African American Vernacular English, or AVE, and Chicano English. So we're going to look at the history and linguistic features of each of those, debunk some common myths and misconceptions, and learn some effective strategies for supporting those students who speak these languages. By the end of this session, I want you to have a deeper understanding of AVE and Chicano English, as well as the tools and strategies you need to create that inclusive and effective learning environment. If you're engaged in podcast studies with others in your professional learning community, you're also going to have an opportunity to collaborate. Pause the presentation and collaborate and discuss best practices. I do recognize that some of you are flying solo, taking care of your own professional learning. And of course, I have some activities for you as well. So don't feel like you need to be part of a group. All right, so we're going to start with African American Vernacular English, or AVE. We're going to look at the history, characteristics, myths, and importance in the classroom. So there is a rich history deeply intertwined with the history of Black Americans in the United States. AVE has its origins. Well, there's a little bit of debate about the origin between linguists. So there's one theory, that's the Creole hypothesis, that suggests that AVE evolved from West African Pidgin English and Creole varieties that were spoken by enslaved Africans in the southern United States. There's another theory, the Anglicist hypothesis, that says that AVE evolved from regional dialects of British English. But despite the debate about where it really came from, the exact origins, most linguists agree that AVE was likely influenced by the multiple languages spoken by enslaved Africans that were brought to the Americas. Certain features of AVE, such as its aspectual system, the use of be to indicate habitual action, we're going to talk about that, are thought to echo the structures that are found in West African languages. Then after the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of the Civil War, Black people began to migrate in large numbers to urban areas in the North, Midwest, and West. So this language came with them. And then in these new environments, it continued to develop and change, influenced by things like where they were, regions, socioeconomic status, and even contact with other languages and dialects or accents. During the 20th century, we had the civil rights movement, and that led to an increased interest and recognition of Black culture and identity, including language. But AVE was often stigmatized and labeled as slang or broken English, reflecting that broad social or societal prejudice against Black people. Despite this, AVE developed a rich tradition in music, literature, and other forms of cultural expression. Then, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, there were a lot of debates about the role of AVE as a language in education. If you've been around for a while or you studied this, you might remember there was this controversial resolution by the Oakland Unified School Board in California back in 1996. And they recognized AVE as a distinct language and proposed using it as a tool for teaching school English. Now, they called it Ebonics, and that sparked this national debate about language, education, and race. But today, present status, AVE is recognized by linguists. It's recognized by TESOL as a systematic and rule-governed dialect, a language with its own unique phonological, grammatical, and lexical features. So regardless of all the stigma and misunderstanding, there is increasing recognition of the importance of AVE in education. And in fact, in California, it is identified, California Department of Education in their state frameworks recognizes AVE as a language. And so children, students who speak AVE are afforded the supports and differentiation that students who come to school speaking a heritage language such as Spanish are afforded. We recognize that it has value as a marker of cultural identity and heritage. So characteristics, AVE is characterized as is Chicano English. We'll see where these are going to be parallel. We're going to look at phonology, grammar, vocabulary, and pragmatics. So starting with phonology, a couple of examples. First is final consonant cluster reduction. And this refers to the tendency of AVE speakers to simplify consonant clusters at the ends of words. For instance, the word hand may be pronounced more like hand, test may become test, and cold may become coal. This reduction happens most frequently when the final consonant in a word is an unstressed syllable. There is the absence of R or R-lessness. In many contexts, speakers of AVE don't pronounce that final R at the end of words. For example, the word car might be pronounced ka, and for might be pronounced fo. This feature is also found in some other dialects of English, particularly those associated with the Boston area and parts of the United Kingdom. So my Bostonians who are listening, when I say ka, they're like, what's wrong with that, right? Another example is dental fricatives, and these are the sounds that are produced by forcing air through the space between the tongue and the teeth. In school English, our primary dental fricative or fricatives are the voiced and voiceless TH sounds, as in the, which is voiced, and with, which is unvoiced or voiceless. So these are interdental fricatives. And in most accents of school English, as the tongue typically protrudes between the teeth, you get that sound or lack of a sound. But in AVE, the TH sounds are often realized very differently. So the dental fricatives are often replaced with other sounds. A voiced TH, as in the, might be realized as a D, as in do, or a V, as in vase. So the might be pronounced as duh. You might hear a student say desto. You'll also notice that there is an R-lessness in there as well. There's the voiceless TH, as in with. You might often hear with, pronounced as an F sound, or as a T, as in toe. So with may be with or wit. Okay. These substitutions are not random. They're consistent. And in my work across the United States and almost every state, I still have 4 to go, as well as Canada and in the Caribbean, I hear this consistently. Right? So it's not random. It's systematic. It is rule governed. It is a consistent part of the dialect. It's also important to remember that there's variation with AVE, and not all speakers will use all of these features. Use sometimes depends on geographic location, age, socioeconomic status, and even the social context of the speech. All right, we have grammar. So habitual be that I mentioned before in AVE, that is often used to indicate a habitual or recurring action or a state of being, right? An action that happens all the time or happens regularly. So you might hear a student say, she be reading, but that doesn't mean she's reading right now. It means that she reads regularly or habitually. Another example is negative concord, and that refers to the use of multiple negatives in a sentence, which in AVE does not result in a positive meaning, not like math and not like school English. For example, an emergent bilingual AVE speaker might say, I ain't no fool, which in school English might be interpreted as a double negative or a positive statement. But in AVE, it is an emphatic negative. The negative concord is an emphatic negative, reinforcing the speaker's assertion that they are not a fool. And then we have multiple modals. So words like might, could, and would in a sentence, which is not typically allowed in school English. But for example, an emergent bilingual AVE speaker might say, he might could go to the store, or he might could go to the stove, which in school English would typically be rendered as he might be able to go to the store, or he could possibly go to the store. Vocabulary. There's no separate vocabulary from other varieties of English, but our emergent bilingual AVE speakers do use some words which are not found in other varieties, and they use some English words in ways that differ from the school English dialect. So a lot of the words that AVE speakers might use have their origins in West African languages that contributed to AVE's development. Words from the Mandingo, such as banana and yam, that have been incorporated into the English language. The Akan word okra or the Western Bantu gumbo. These are words that we recognize now as English words. But we also have words that are composed of an English and West African form and meaning. So it could be an English form and a West African meaning, or a West African form and an English meaning. And there are so many of those. I'm only going to give you one example. The word bogus, which in English means fake or fraudulent, actually derives from the Hausa word boko or boko boko, which means deceit or fraud. Okay. All right. I could go on, got a long list. We don't have that kind of time. And then we have loan translations or calques. And this is where a complex idea is expressed in a West African language by a combination of two words. So in AVE, these African words appear to have been directly translated, and the same concept is expressed in AVE by a combination of the English equivalent items. For example, in AVE, we might say bad eye, which means a nasty look, which actually comes from the Mandingo word. Same meaning, hateful glance in Mandingo, and I cannot necessarily pronounce the words in Mandingo. And then we have pragmatics. And pragmatics is that branch of linguistics that deals with language in use and the context in which it's used, such as the taking of turns in conversation, text organization, presupposition, etc. So in AVE, one of the things that's very common, a traditional pattern in African and in Black American culture, where a speaker or performer makes a statement and the audience responds. Often it's highly interactive, very participatory. The pattern is very frequently found in a religious and ceremonial context. If you've ever been to a Black church, you may have heard some call and response. If you've been in the audience when I have been speaking, there's some call and response in there as well. But it also takes place in everyday conversation among speakers of AVE. Conversation rules, we have our own. In AVE, taking turns and talking over one another, it's a little bit different. So our speakers of AVE, you may hear them talking over one another routinely, not taking turns. That is normal. It's a characteristic of the language. It is not disrespectful. So bear that in mind. Another pragmatic issue is signifying. This is a very complex form of indirect communication. It can involve humor, irony, metaphor, figurative language, but it involves a high degree of shared cultural knowledge and understanding. There may be, in signifying, an AVE speaker might insult someone indirectly, and it will be stated in a way such as only those who speak AVE, who understand the culture, understand the true meaning of what was said. And then that brings me to playing the dozens. And this is a sort of ritualized insult game where two participants exchange these creative and hyperbolic insults, usually in front of an audience. And it refers to this customary series of back and forth insults. And while this might seem to be rude or hostile to outsiders, there's a lot of humor there. And it's governed by this shared community norm that really also is a form of social bonding. So there are some myths around AVE, of course, and many misconceptions. I'm going to give you the three most common myths and give you the facts behind it. So the first myth is that AVE is broken or slang English. I hope you know by now it is not. AVE is a fully formed language with a systematic grammar and vocabulary, just like any other dialect or language. It is not broken. It is not slang English. It is a distinct linguistic system with roots in English and West African languages spoken by the ancestors of today's Black Americans. Number two, myth. AVE lacks grammatical complexity. Well, here's the fact. Like every language, AVE has complex grammatical rules. One that I gave you, the habitual be, as in he be working. That's a feature that's not found in school English, but it clearly indicates a habitual or recurring action. Misunderstanding or a lack of familiarity with these rules has led many to incorrectly perceive AVE as lacking structure or complexity. Myth number three, speakers of AVE are lazy or uneducated. Well, I'll take personal offense to that because I do speak AVE from time to time in certain cultural contexts, definitely in family settings. And I would argue that with a terminal degree, I am not uneducated and certainly not lazy. This myth is all about societal biases. It's all about racial prejudice. It is not about linguistic reality. Speaking a dialect is not a sign of laziness or lack of education. It just reflects a person's cultural background, their community, their identity. It's also worth noting that many AVE speakers are bidialectical or multilingual, and we're capable of code switching between AVE and other forms of English depending on the context. But these three myths illustrate how language and societal attitudes intersect. Challenging these myths is an important step towards recognizing and respecting linguistic diversity. All right, so let's move on to Chicano English. Again, we're going to look at history, characteristics, myths, and the importance in the classroom. So Chicano English, Mexican English, spoken primarily by Mexican Americans and particularly in the southwestern United States. Development and history of the language are closely tied to patterns of immigration and the unique cultural and social experiences of the Mexican American community. So where did it all begin? Well, Chicano English, next language, Chicano English developed among Mexican American populations in the U.S., particularly in those regions that are close to the Mexican border. So think Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California. Yes, it is influenced by the Spanish language, but it's important to note that it's a variety of English and can be spoken by individuals who do not speak Spanish. So secondly, there's immigration and development. When the Mexican-American War ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which led to Mexico ceding large parts of its territory to the U.S., along with the Gadsden Purchase. So we're talking from like 1848 to 1853 with the end of the war and then the Gadsden Purchase. You had a lot of Mexicans that all of a sudden were no longer in Mexico. They were within the boundaries of the United States. And then over time, with the continued migration from Mexico and that ongoing interaction between Spanish and English speakers, we had this unique English dialect of Chicano English, which began to form. Then in the 20th century, this language continued to develop. And during this time, there were substantial Mexican immigrant communities that came to the U.S. or were already in the U.S., and particularly in urban areas and agricultural regions of the Southwest. Now, despite being coherent and systematic as a language, Chicano English has often been stigmatized and misunderstood, much like other non-school English languages, such as AVE. Today, Chicano English is recognized as a distinct dialect of English. It is a sociocultural language. It's spoken by many Mexican Americans, regardless of whether or not they speak Spanish. And its use is not limited by any particular socioeconomic class. We have researchers who've studied the unique phonetic, syntactic, and lexical characteristics, and it is featured prominently in various forms of media and literature, and that contributes to its recognition and validation. Chicano English is an essential part of the rich tapestry of American English languages and reflects the history, culture, and experiences of the Mexican American community. So let's look at the characteristics of this language. So we'll start again with phonology. Here, we're going to talk about vowel pronunciation as our first example. We have certain vowels in Chicano English that are pronounced differently than in school English. For example, the short I as in sit, pronounced I in school English, may be pronounced more like a short E or E as in set. So sit may become set. We have consonant changes. For example, the sh or sh in school English is pronounced more like a ch or ch, making sheet sound more like jeet. And another example are the V and B sounds that are sometimes interchangeable. So B and V. And this is due to the influence of Spanish. If you're a Spanish speaker, you may know that not to get too complex, but the labial dental pronunciation of those two letters, B and V, are almost imperceptible. And again, that depends on which Spanish you're speaking. If it is traditional Spanish, if it's Castilian Spanish, if it's Caribbean Spanish, again, there are different expressions of the sounds in different accents. Okay, where are we? Consonant changes. Next, we have stress patterns. So Chicano English sometimes has different stress patterns than those that are found in school English. So, for example, words can have a stress on a first syllable instead of a second. One example or two examples. So cement becomes cement and garage becomes garage. Then we have morphology and syntax. First up, multiple negation. Very similar to AVE. Multiple negation can be used for emphasis. For example, I don't know nothing about that. Okay. That's emphasis. And regularization of irregular verbs. For example, an emergent bilingual Chicano English speaker might say he go to the store instead of he went to the store. Next we have vocabulary. And so there's some Spanish borrowings. Chicano English has numerous words that have its origin in Spanish, and some are used even in primarily English conversation. An example might be words or phrases like quinceañera or mi casa es su casa. There are also some unique terms in Chicano English and phrases that might not be found in other varieties of English that reflect the culture and experience of the Mexican American community. In terms of pragmatics, our discourse markers, one would be the use of or what at the end of a sentence, right? Are you going to the store with me or what? Okay. So another is indirect communication, and this is a tendency to show politeness or deference, which reflects the cultural value of respect and courtesy. So suppose, for example, a person wants to ask their friend for a ride home, but they want to be polite, a little indirect about it. We might say a little coy about it. So instead of saying, hey, can you give me a ride home, which is quite direct, they might say, you're going in the direction of my house after this, right? Or, man, it's going to be hard for me to catch a bus at this hour. In both of these statements, the person isn't explicitly asking for a ride, but rather hinting at it, expecting the friend to understand because there is a cultural understanding and offer the ride. So they avoid imposing by asking directly, which is a way of showing politeness, respect, and consideration for the other person's autonomy. Now, it's important to note that understanding indirect communication heavily depends on that shared social and cultural norm. So the level of indirectness that's considered polite or appropriate may vary greatly in different social contexts or cultural contexts. Now, just as in AVE and with all language varieties, it's important to remember that these features will not be present in every speaker's language and can vary depending on factors, again, such as region, age, socioeconomic status, and individual linguistic idiosyncrasies. Chicano English is vibrant and systemic linguistics that reflects the cultural heritage and history of the Mexican American community. So, just like before, there are some myths that are about Chicano English and language often misunderstood. So myth number one, again, Chicano English is broken or incorrect English. Here's the truth. Chicano English is a fully developed and systematic dialect of English with its own consistent rules of grammar, pronunciation, and usage. It is not a deficient form of English. It is a different form of English. Myth number 2, Chicano English is simply English spoken with a Spanish accent, or it's Spanglish. Here's the truth, the facts. Yes, it is true that Chicano English has been influenced by Spanish. It's not just English spoken with a Spanish accent, nor is it Spanglish, which is a mix of Spanish and English that is sometimes used by some bilingual speakers as they develop English as a language. Chicano English is a distinct dialect of English. It is a distinct language on its own that can be spoken by individuals who do not speak Spanish. And myth number 3, all Mexican Americans or Chicanos speak Chicano English. Nope. Here's the fact. Chicano English is spoken by many Mexican Americans, but not all. Some might speak only Spanish. Others might speak only school English. And still others might be bilingual in Spanish and English. And there may be even some that are trilingual, speaking Spanish, English, and Chicano English. Even among speakers of Chicano English, there can be considerable variation based on, again, these same factors: region, socioeconomic status, age, and individual experience. But educating people about all of these myths is important to promoting understanding and respect for linguistic diversity. Chicano English, like all language varieties, again, reflects history, culture, and experiences of the people who speak it. Now, whether it's Chicano English or African American English, it's important to recognize these in the classroom for a number of reasons. Number 1, when we recognize sociocultural English as a valid language form, it helps to validate the cultural identity of our Black students and our Chicano students. It acknowledges that their language, like all languages, has rules and structure, and that it is not incorrect school English. Number 2, we recognize and understand sociocultural English. It promotes an inclusive learning environment. Educators, talking to you directly, classroom teachers, when you respect and appreciate linguistic diversity, your students are more likely to feel acknowledged, valued, and accepted. And when that happens, you create a culture in your classroom where children want to learn. Reason number 3 is bilingual education. Understanding that a child may be speaking African American vernacular or Chicano English at home and then expected to use school English at school highlights the fact that many of these students are effectively bilingual. And they are code switching between 2 distinct language systems. And this is a skill that should be respected and utilized in our educational environment. And this is where we get to additive bilingualism, not subtractive. We want our children to be able to function in all of the places and spaces that they find themselves in. Our job as educators is to use their home language as a bridge to the school language without taking away the language of home. So number 4 is improved communication and teaching. Teachers who understand sociocultural English languages can communicate more effectively with their students. You have the ability to adapt your teaching strategies to better suit your students' needs. This is true differentiation. This means being able to instruct students in the differences between AVE and Chicano English against school English without devaluing or denigrating the language and culture of home. Number 5, enhancing our learning outcomes. There is research that suggests that using sociocultural English as a bridge to teaching school English can improve literacy outcomes for Black and Chicano students. When we teach students to code switch effectively, they're better prepared for different social and professional environments. Let them keep their language. Simply tell them that, hey, when we're in the classroom, the language we're going to use is school English. But if you don't have the school English word, let's use the language you have, and then let me teach you how to put that into school English. All right? We want them to be successful. Number 6 is fostering social equality and recognizing that sociocultural English can play a role in a larger societal issues such as addressing linguistic prejudice, addressing discrimination, addressing racism. By legitimizing AVE and Chicano English in the classroom, we can help foster greater social equality, understanding, and social justice. And then there's identity affirmation. When we acknowledge and respect sociocultural English educators, we can affirm the identities of our Black and Chicano students. We can reinforce and help to build their self-esteem and encourage active participation and engagement in our classrooms. And then last, number 8 is multicultural education. Recognizing sociocultural English supports these principles or the principle of multicultural education. And that means that we're preparing all students for a diverse world that they do live in by fostering understanding and respect for different cultures, different languages, and their associated practices. So in essence, we recognize sociocultural English in the classroom. We are doing a lot towards creating a culturally responsive teaching environment. We're supporting the creation of an inclusive, effective learning environment, a classroom, a school that respects and values diversity. All right, so a prep your practice activity. If you're working with a group doing podcast study, I want you to discuss the 3 questions on screen. Who speaks AVE or Chicano English in your school community? How have you treated this language in past practice? And what are your thoughts about these languages now? Now, just a side note on that, I remember I was doing a workshop once and I asked in this room of, 150 or so people, and I knew from the people in the room in the community that there were speakers of AVE and Chicano English among the educators. And I asked who spoke Chicano English and who spoke AVE. And there was a tremendous amount of hesitation among the professionals, these educators in this session. And what they shared was that they did not talk about it outside of their own communities because of the negative perceptions about having that language. So if you're together in a room where you've got that type of diversity, have that conversation as well. Now, these questions appear in your handout. If you're working solo, haven't forgotten about you, just take a little bit of time for reflective journaling on these questions. Again, how you know how to do this, pause the podcast and then come back when you're ready. All right, let's discuss now some effective strategies for supporting our emergent bilingual learners who speak AVE and Chicano English. These strategies also appear in your handout, and you'll want to take notes on each, as you're going to need these to prep for the Prep Your Practice activity that follows. So strategy number one, recognize these learners are emergent bilingual learners. I know I probably said that 10 times so far, so I'll say it for the 12th. These learners are emergent bilingual learners, just as a child who comes to school speaking any other world language. Emphasize the students' linguistic strengths by using their sociocultural language as a foundation for learning. This validates their home language and encourages them to use their linguistic skills for academic success. Number 2, you want to encourage code switching and translanguaging. That means allowing them to use elements from both their home language and from school English. Now, this strategy promotes linguistic flexibility and helps students navigate between different linguistic contexts. So what is code switching? Code switching in linguistics is alternating between 2 or more languages or language varieties in a single conversation, in a sentence, or even within a single phrase. This is a phenomenon that's commonly observed among bilingual and multilingual speakers. So code switching serves several functions in communication, particularly among our emergent bilingual and multilingual speakers, and especially those who are at the lower levels of language proficiency. So some of the key functions, number 1 is emphasis. Code switching can be used to emphasize a point or to add emphasis to a particular part of a conversation. For instance, a speaker might switch to their native language to express strong emotions or to highlight an important point. Number 2 is identity expression. Code switching can serve as a means to express identity and to signal membership in a specific community. By switching codes, speakers can demonstrate their cultural background, their bilingualism, or their membership in a particular social group. If you've been in the audience, depending on where I am, I may speak both Spanish Well, all three, Spanish, English, and AVE. One, to validate the people in the audience who speak those languages. I'm not really good at Chicano English. I'll just, my Spanish is okay. My Chicano English is probably terrible. So I don't use that. But there's a connection there, right, for people in the group, that social group. Number three is conveying nuance. Some concepts, some sentiments are better expressed or have a different meaning or nuance in one language over another. So a speaker may code switch to more accurately convey their thoughts and their feelings. Number four is social functions. So code switching can be used to set a social atmosphere, to indicate solidarity with a group, to show respect or formality, or to create a social distance. Number five would be instructional functions. And in educational settings, teachers might use code switching as a scaffold to help students understand or learn a concept in their second language. In my classroom, when I taught sixth grade, I often had speakers children whose primary language was Spanish, and they were at a ELD level 1 on a scale of 1 to 5. They were at the lower levels, just starting to learn English. And so often I would introduce the concept in Spanish and then reintroduce it in English so they could hear both the English and Spanish. But I needed to give that to them in Spanish so that I knew that they had the concept. And then I worked on the second language. So if you have that ability to use a code switch as a scaffold, if you have that ability, so I'm talking specifically to my teachers who speak AVE or Chicano English, you can use that to make that connection. Okay, number 6, lexical need. Sometimes speakers switch languages simply because they can't remember or they don't know a particular word in the language they're currently using. I do this all the time when I'm speaking Spanish because my Spanish is not phenomenal. And so I can be rattling along and then all of a sudden I don't know a word. So I'll use the English word, make sure that there's understanding there, and then I'll go back to my Spanish. Our children will do this as they learn to navigate the language. For pragmatic reasons, last reason, pragmatics. Speakers might code switch for reasons related to the conversation's context. It could be the topic, it could be the relationship between the speakers, or it could be the social setting. Code switching, again, not a sign of linguistic deficiency. It is a sophisticated linguistic strategy that bilingual and multilingual speakers use to navigate social contexts and to express their identities. Now, similar to code switching, there's translanguaging. Translanguaging involves this fluid use of multiple languages in communication. So translanguaging, unlike a traditional perspective where different languages are treated as separate systems, translanguaging views an individual's full linguistic repertoire as one integrated system. And so this allows bilingual and multilingual individuals to draw on all their language resources without regard for traditional language boundaries. For instance, a person might speak, write, and read in a mix of languages based on their communicative needs and the social context. Translanguaging has important implications for language education. In our classroom setting, this might involve strategies such as allowing students to use their home language to help them understand and express ideas in a second language, or creating learning activities that intentionally mix languages. You can support students' bilingual development this way, enhance their comprehension and engagement, and validate their linguistic identity. However, bear in mind, implementing translanguaging strategies in education requires thoughtful planning and a deep understanding of students' linguistic backgrounds and abilities. So that's kind of don't just go out and try this without some additional training and support. This micro session is not sufficient training and support for being able to utilize translanguaging in your classroom practices. Don't try this in your classroom if you're not ready. All right, number 3, teach culturally responsively. Adopting culturally responsive teaching practices acknowledges and respects cultural backgrounds, our students' cultural backgrounds. So incorporate culturally relevant materials and activities so that you make learning more engaging and meaningful. I covered this extensively in the last episode, so if you didn't listen to that one, dip back into it or go to it for a refresher or just some basic understanding. Number 4, encourage collaboration and peer support. You want to facilitate collaborative learning opportunities where students can work together and support each other. This fosters a sense of community. It allows students to learn from their peers. There is social connectedness there. There is common language there. But don't do this based on race. You do this based on language, or you simply allow the learners to use the languages that they have when they're working in collaborative or cooperative groups. And finally, differentiate instruction and assessment to accommodate your students' diverse learning needs. Adapt your teaching methods, your materials, and your assessments to make sure all students can achieve their full potential. This topic is covered extensively across multiple chapters in my book, Affecting Change for Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Learners. The book is available on Amazon or wherever books are sold. There is a link in your handout or a note in your handout about that. If you're doing book study on that with your PLC, it is something that I go and support in person. The book I wrote, I designed it to help you develop a comprehensive instructional system addressing what you teach and how you teach, assess, and make decisions based on data to improve outcomes for every learner. But that's it. Number 5, differentiate instruction and assessment. All right. Time again to prep your practice. Now, this one's more or less homework. You have the bulk of the content, and I've just got a couple more slides to share with you. So when the podcast is over, grab a lesson plan. And whether you're working with a group doing podcast study or you're working solo, take a look at the lesson that you've chosen. I want you to think about, annotate, and discuss, if you're with a group, ways to incorporate, recognize, acknowledge, and leverage African American Vernacular English and Chicano English into the lesson. This is really easy if you're using literature that's related to a variety of cultures, particularly Black American or Mexican American cultures in your classroom instruction. Think about how you can adapt the lesson plan, okay? But hang on, don't leave me yet. Don't prep your practice right now. Let's recap real quick. In this workshop, we've explored history and characteristics of African American Vernacular English and Chicano English. We've debunked some common myths, and we've discussed effective strategies to support emergent bilingual learners. On your own, you're going to work on adapting that lesson that you're choosing. So you've got some homework to do. I want to thank you for joining me. I hope you've got some new tools and strategies for creating a linguistically inclusive classroom. Continue to join me every week. Send me your questions, topics, and requests to askdrberry.com. Of course, I will answer those questions. Sometimes it becomes a whole podcast episode, and I'll bring you some experts to help address those topics. Now, like, share, subscribe, turn on notifications, and as always, don't worry about the things you cannot change. Change the things you can no longer accept. And I'll see you next time.